Welcome back to another Catching Up on the Classics video. This month I read the Epic of Gilgamesh. This was not by any means the first epic poem that I've read. I've also read the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Beowulf, and the Song of Roland. However, Gilgamesh comes from a very different culture and time period than any of those, and I found that it was a very different experience reading it. For one thing, I was not very familiar with the history or mythology that it was based on, so all of the historical context and the names of the gods and goddesses and whatnot, that's something that I had to do some research on in order to understand it, whereas for example, the Iliad, when I first read that, I was already very familiar with the Trojan War and Greek mythology, and so I still, needed a little bit of context for it, but not nearly to the same extent as with this one. This was also quite a bit older than other epics that I've read, and in fact one website that I found said that it's the oldest known work of fiction. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of a supposedly real king who lived and reigned in the 2000s BC. It was recorded on stone tablets, the oldest of which date back to about 2100 BC, although there are other versions as well that date back to a more recent time. It's also believed to have originated from stories that were told even earlier than that, though, and to have been passed down orally before eventually being written down. Compared to other famous works of ancient literature like the Iliad and the Odyssey, for instance, it was actually discovered quite recently, at a place called Nineveh in the 19th century. If the name Nineveh sounds familiar to you, that's probably because it is. It features pretty prominently in the Old Testament of the Bible, most famously when Jonah is sent there and ends up running the other direction and getting swallowed by a whale instead. The Epic of Gilgamesh follows the story of Gilgamesh's reign as king of Uruk, his friendship with a man called Enkidu, their heroic accomplishments together, the friend's death, Gilgamesh's quest to find immortality, a flood narrative that's very similar to the one in Genesis, and then finally the death of Gilgamesh. Despite encompassing a large number of events, the story is actually relatively short. Here's my copy of it right here. And just for comparison, here's my copy of the Iliad. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that Gilgamesh is a much more straightforward narrative. Even though there's a lot going on, it doesn't have the huge cast of characters that the Iliad does. It's also told in a much more straightforward and simplistic style. Now, the translation that I read, sometimes epic poems are translated as prose and sometimes they're translated in a way that attempts to make them work as poetry, and this is a prose translation of Gilgamesh. So it doesn't do like the poetic line breaks or anything like that, but still, I think even if it did, the style in which it's told and the level of detail that's given is much more straightforward and simplistic than even things that came from later periods in the ancient world. I have to say that overall, I didn't really enjoy reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. I didn't really enjoy reading the Iliad either, so, maybe epic poems are just not my thing. I read the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid all together for a college class, and I had read the Odyssey before in high school. And I read Beowulf and the Song of Roland for school as well. So this is the first one that I've chosen to read on my own just because I wanted to. Maybe epic poems just are not my thing. Although I have to say I really like the Odyssey, so, In any case, I didn't, personally get super invested in the story, and Gilgamesh as a main character I feel like is kind of difficult to relate to or care about that much for me. All that stuff at the beginning about how he was such a cruel and unpleasant king that his people were, literally praying for divine intervention, that just, left a bad taste in my mouth from the outset that he was never quite able to recover from, as far as I was concerned. And even aside from the main character, like a lot of works of literature that originate from oral tradition, it has a lot of repetition in it. And that just doesn't make for the most pleasant reading experience nowadays. I mean, there's this whole part where he's having a prophetic dream that foretells the arrival of Enkidu, and he has the dream, and then he explains to himself what he saw in the dream and how it's interpreted, and then he goes to his mother and he tells her in almost the exact same words what he saw in the dream and how he interpreted it, and so you just get it repeated over and over. And I do understand why that's the case. When stories like this were told orally, that sort of thing would help the person telling the story to remember it, and help their audience to remember it, because you couldn't just look back on a previous page. It's just so different from the classics of the modern or early modern era that I spend more time reading that I guess that just, it made it a little bit tedious. Tedious, I think, is the word that I'm looking for. On some level, though, I think that sort of difference is really fascinating. The ways in which the culture that we live in and the language that we use and the medium through which the story is passed down, whether it's orally or stone tablets or books or audiovisual media in the modern day or whatever, the ways in which those things influence the way we tell stories, I think is absolutely fascinating. So, you know, even though this isn't necessarily a book that I'm going to read again over and over, I do think it was really cool to be able to see how stories were told in that time period and what kinds of stories they saw as being worth telling and the ways in which the narrative unfolded. There's so much to be learned about different time periods and places through their literature, and I think that this is a great example of that. In any case, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.